So, let me get this straight. The day you meet, she invites you into her big warm tent, treats you to a hot, home-cooked meal and chats with you till late. And then you go back to your own, cold-ass tent for the night. Captain Germond was there, too. Sure, let's call that fair for now. You ride together with her for all of the next day, then she brings you along for a meeting you don't have the rank for. And then you have a late dinner together and she chats away with you till late again. After you get up in your own bed again, you come out and she's there to meet you for breakfast with a smile. I'm supposed to be her attaché. Aha. So now we're freezing our asses off in this god's forsaken field in the middle of winter and she invites you into her nice warm tent again and feeds you, without the cap'n this time. You stay up till late with her and you still wake up in your own tent. Rangobart frowned at Harlow. Harlow returned his gaze with a cold, level stare. Coward. Harlow ducked away with a laugh as Rangobart reached out for him. She's not some village girl, Rangobart scowled. She's noble-born. Nobles always offer hospitality no matter how they feel about you. I didn't ever get none of that hospitality from you. Not that I wanna crawl into your tent. Rangobart turned and walked away with a sigh, heading over to a faucet of spring water fastened to a nearby post. After rinsing his hands, he returned to a field on the 2nd Legion's exercise grounds which had several sections marked out in chalk over the grass. On a platform overlooking one side of the field was Baroness Saradnik, who was observing the Imperial Air Service's drills with Wing Commander Burke. As he came up the steps to join them, a flight of 3 hippogriffs streaked by in a low pass. A punishing rain of arrows fell over a set of hay bales lined up erratically over the ground. So this is strafing. Yes, my lady, Wing Commander Burke nodded. In terms of the Imperial Air Service's roles, close air support is perhaps the most pivotal in our regular operations. Our dragoons and war wizards have the mobility and freedom to strike anywhere in a theater as the situation demands. It looks like they hit 1 out of 3, Lady Zaradnik said. That's very impressive. How long did your dragoons take to achieve this degree of accuracy? The flight did get about that many, but most of the ones that landed were likely from the formation's captain. From the time they enter service, it takes the average dragoon upwards of 5 years of regular training to land 1 out of 10 regular attacks from the height you just saw them loose their arrows at. I assume that they employ martial arts to improve their chances if necessary. Regular volleys are fine for densely packed groups. They'd wreak havoc against the pike formations of Riastize's Royal Army, for example. When things get sparse, just one moment here. Wing Commander Burke turned his attention to another formation coming in to strafe the field. After a moment, the lead hippogriff dove on its own. As the flight's captain sped by, every second bale was planted with one of his arrows. Lady Zaradnik nodded slightly. How do you deal with retaliation from the ground? She asked. Potential threats are identified in advance, the blue-haired man replied. In times of war there'd always be plenty for us to do, so we can simply stay away and hit the enemy elsewhere. If we are ordered to attack a risky position, we try to gauge the enemy's maximum effective range and attack from beyond it. Also, as with any vocation that employs bonded mounts, a dragoon's mount is much harder to deal with than a regular mount. They can take far more punishment and they're devastating in a strike. Since we use hippogriffs or griffins, you can probably imagine the kind of mess that makes. Do your war wizards have similar riding skills as your dragoons? They don't have bonded mounts or advanced cavalry training, so they can't handle hard maneuvering or any of the more interesting things that our dragoons are capable of. If I were to put it nicely, they're more a passenger than a rider. Some of them do learn how to better handle their mounts after years of service, but it isn't necessary to perform their role. As he spoke, another flight dove from the heights. A wedge of 3 hippogriffs swept over the field in advance of a 4th. At the lowest point in their pass, a bead of flame streaked down from the 4th hippogriff. The fireball exploded in the midst of a neat formation of metal posts. Something like that, Wing Commander Burke smirked. That wizard was more accurate than the dragoons. Magic's funny like that. We dragoons tend to think it's unfair. Most spells have a fraction of a bow's range, but magic doesn't care about your airspeed or the wind or whatever. They point a finger and it goes where it goes. Some spells, like Magic Arrow, don't even care about how dismal the caster's aim is. The odor of charred grass drifted over the platform. Another flight made a pass, lighting the field aflame again. A legion's air wing seems an overwhelming advantage, Lady Zaradnik said. You can destroy supply lines, harass camps and formations, or even set towns and cities ablaze. Wars can be won without needing to face an enemy on the field. A chill traveled up Rangobart's spine. It was a way of thinking that was not promoted in the Imperial Army, perhaps the first hint that Lady Zaradnik was not exactly the same as the martial nobles of the Empire. Like Rangobart, the wing commander frowned. In theory, yes, he said after several moments. Deployed military assets are considered fair targets for the Imperial Air Service and the Imperial Army in general. It is against the Army's policy to strike directly at civilian targets and infrastructure. Also, while not a hard rule, we won't engage forces that have lost their will to fight. I can see the influence of Baharuth's martial nobility in these policies and attitudes. Is it not the same for the nobility of Riastais? Wing Commander Burke asked. Lady Zaradnik looked out across the grounds where the Imperial Air Service continued their drills, then her gaze traveled to the pastoral vista beyond. In times of war, she said, a noble's duty is to fight for land and liege. As warriors, they face other warriors in battle. Collateral damage from such contests must be kept to a minimum to honor their opponents who are similarly fulfilling their obligations. This respect is extended to the lands and peoples of their enemies. Contests are held in the wilderness and in the wastelands. Sieges result in undesirable devastation and are preferably avoided. In the ideal situation, the outcomes of war are determined by the blade on the battlefield and settled with diplomacy. Rangobart relaxed as the words rolled smoothly off of her lips. The wing commander, too, seemed to lose his tension. It was the responsible way in which to wage war. Civilized men did not engage in unbridled savagery. That's right, my lady, Wing Commander Burke nodded. Then I will say that it is my assumption that the majority of nobles in Riastais consider this the proper and honorable way to wage war. I cannot vouch for each one of them personally, of course. Of course. Also, the Baroness added, House Zaradnik does not fight this way. The chill returned. Wing Commander Burke placed his left hand on the railing as he turned to regard her with a furrowed brow. May I ask what you mean by this, my lady? This is not out of any malignant intent, the Baroness explained. It is simply the product of generations of defense conducted against the tribes of the Abelian wilderness. While we did receive assistance from the south on occasion, we did not have anything remotely resembling the Imperial Army. We were mere hundreds against tens of thousands in the unclaimed lands across the border. What? Rangobart's eyes grew wide, but how? By not fighting in the manner previously described, Lady Zaradnik smiled slightly. Rangers are master skirmishers and my house excels at fighting in a fashion demanded by a century of protracted conflict. For me, I suppose it cannot be considered protracted, it is simply normal. I do not mean to say that we do not hold the same values, but our circumstances required a different approach to conflict. Rangobart couldn't imagine what that would be like. The Imperial Army used small, mixed squads to patrol the borders in conjunction with support from the Imperial Air Service. Threats too large for the patrols to handle were met with the appropriate force. Demi-human tribes were dealt with by some combination of companies, while divisions would handle mass migrations. Tens of thousands of demi-humans was a force that required the mobilization of multiple legions. Fending them off with mere hundreds was a feat that begged belief. The wing commander's reaction was veiled, though it betrayed no hint of incredulity. Perhaps he was calculating whether it could be done by employing the methods Lady Zaradnik had hinted at. A set of winged shadows traveled over the field nearest to them. The Baroness turned her attention back to the drills just in time to see 3 dragoons land in sequence on a strip of marked-out grass. 2 landed within the bounds of 2-meter-wide circles while the third had a foot out of his. The head of his spear sliced through the air as he cursed in frustration. It doesn't look like they sustained any injuries from that, Lady Zaradnik said. Are they using some skill or martial art to land safely from a height? No, my lady, Wing Commander Burke replied. In theory, it's possible for a warrior to prevent injury with the proper timing of fortress, but it's unnecessary for our dragoons. The more experienced they are, the higher they can fall without injuring themselves. Landing where one intends to is another matter entirely, however. As with mounted archery, the attacker's speed and heading, the wind, distance and the movements of the target all need to be factored in. Aerial insertions are one of the flashiest things our dragoons can do, but at the same time it requires a lot of training to pull off properly. When does a flight employ this in practice? It's most effective when a few good men can make a big difference on the ground, which most often happens when regular patrols risk casualties against groups of demi-human raiders or the occasional magical beast. If a few combatants can make a significant difference, Lady Zaradnik asked, can't a dragoon land with their mount to add its combat power to the battle? The wing commander replied immediately as if the question was one he was well accustomed to answering. The answer is that seconds matter. To land, a mount has to slow down. A single flight usually supports several patrols over a wide area, so they're positioned accordingly. Descending in such a way that the mount can land upon arrival slows our response enough that an entire patrol can be wiped out. It's better to dive and maintain the speed that we gain to get dragoons on the ground faster. I see. Also, the wing commander added, it's not as if we don't bring our mounts into a fight when needed. An aerial insertion usually comes in two parts. The dragoon lands to join a fight, then the mount wheels around to shed velocity and hits the enemy in the flank. Demi-humans usually scatter when they witness a half-dozen of their allies get skewered and dismembered in a few seconds. Below them, the three dragoons walked off of the field, settling down on a bench for a meal. They looked up towards the platform, and Lady Zaradnik smiled back at them. Thank you for your explanation, Wing Commander. I've long known about the existence of the Imperial Air Service, but its operations were always a mystery. Officer Aburbad. Yes, my lady? We should go and have lunch before we continue our inspection of the camp. Of course, Rangobard nodded. He accompanied Lady Zaradnik back to her tent, where she bid him be seated at the table after he removed his coat and gloves. Once she laid out the dishes and utensils, she brought out one of her large magical containers, placing it between them. The cover was removed, revealing a large portion prepared in the city from the evening before the last. It was the same hearty meal that they had for the previous day's dinner, which was nothing to complain about considering the alternative was camp food. Upon starting their meal, Lady Zaradnik initiated one of the curious discussions that she always seemed to engage in. Some of the reactions that you and the wing commander displayed to my words brought to mind a question that I've had since meeting with General Carbane and his command staff. What might that be, my lady? Would you say that the members of the general staff are representative of what one might find in any legion? Many of the men are martial nobles hailing from cavalry traditions, while most of the others are civilians who rose to positions of command. Additionally, there was a member of the clergy from each division. I believe that you would find that in every legion's general staff, yes. Do you not think it's imbalanced? Lady Zaradnik asked. If not for my having brought you along, there wasn't a single mage there. My experience is that those from different vocations and walks of life can offer valuable perspectives that would otherwise not be considered. Mages appear to have integrated with the companies, but they do not have any representation in General Carbane's command. He wasn't sure what the point of that would be. The commanders were there because they were commanders. The clergy was present because they served not only as battlefield support but saw to the health and general well-being of their respective divisions. Mages did not serve any overarching roles in the Imperial Army. I am certain that the commanders have a firm grasp on what their arcane casters are capable of. The Baroness murmured. A friend told me recently that the situation of mages in the Baharuth Empire could be compared to that of well-compensated tools. These words might have tinted my perception, but it does appear to be the case when it comes to those in the Empire's service. The idea that mages were tools had a decidedly dulled effect on Rangobard. Never mind the government, the only reason he wasn't cast out of his household as a spare was that he had the capacity for magic. Furthermore, all noble scions were tools, so he wasn't sure why Lady Zaradnik had made a point of anyone being treated like one. The martial nobles that I know, no, most people who I am familiar with, believe that our society has roles that require filling and that it is society that determines the value of a person. To be frank, I am hard-pressed to find any faults with this rationale. If what one pursues or produces holds no value to anyone, then they have no livelihood. One either studies or works to build and maintain civilization, or they have no place in it. As a noble, Lady Zaradnik said, I understand what the perspective is derived from and agree with it to an extent, but I also understand where it is lacking. I am not in any way attempting to undermine the authority of General Carbane, but the way his command is staffed means that certain things are appreciated more than others. I am not a mage, but, as a ranger, I've already identified a multitude of issues with the way that the Imperial Army operates. The Empire, by extension, can be seen as having issues stemming from the same imbalance. Could you provide me with an example of this imbalance, my lady? Your stated position is that society determines the value of a person, but who is it that determines what is valuable? If we take General Carbane's command staff as an example, does anyone that occupies an influential position within it qualify as an expert in arcane magic? Does anyone familiar with matters of the arcane contribute towards building a greater military culture that acts to support military mages in the same way that the Imperial Army reinforces the traditions of the Empire's martial nobility? Or are mages simply convenient pieces of magical artillery? How long has this been the case? As far as he knew, it had always been the case. Regardless of whether it was Rangobatra Burbad or Fluda Paradine, the military saw mages for the effects of the spells that they cast. Magical artillery, as Lady Zaradnik bluntly termed it. To the Imperial Army, the Imperial Magic Academy was an institution that produced more magical artillery, and the Imperial Ministry of Magic was magical artillery to be used in case of emergencies. When it came to matters of culture, mages tended to mingle with other mages. With the army at large, interactions were company level, at best. In a word, mages lacked inertia. Arcane casters were rare, military mages were even more so, and each company only had a handful at best. Mages with academic leanings tended to only care about the esteem of their peers. Though crucial to imperial society, mages existed in a bubble that separated them from the rest of the imperial culture. There were simply not enough of them in the right positions to exert broad influence on the prevailing culture of the Empire or the Imperial Army. Rangobat was fairly certain that he had heard something like this discussed before, but he wasn't sure where it was from. You appear to be implying that the current state of affairs for military mages is untenable, he asked. Is there something you plan on doing about it? Me? Lady Zaradnik raised an eyebrow. I am merely a liaison officer. My duty is to assist with the current operation while cultivating understanding between the Imperial Army and the Sorceress Kingdom. It is not my place to dictate how the Imperial Army should be organizing itself or shaping its culture. The most I can do is offer my observations when it comes to these matters. As I said to General Carbane and his command staff, true pride cannot be fashioned out of accomplishments that are not of one's own legacy. These accomplishments are not simply military achievements, but everything that goes into forming the very essence of what the Baharuth Empire is and what it means to be one of its citizens. So the real question is, Officer Aburbad, what do you plan on doing about it? Rangobat stared silently at his half-finished meal. The Baroness was less than a year older than he was, yet she seemed to be in an entirely different place in life. She was driven by some force that Rangobat lacked, something beyond simply putting one foot before the other as he climbed the steps of his career. It made her both enchanting and intimidating at the same time, an elegant blade directed with purposeful intent. The silence stretched on for several moments before he could manage an uncertain reply. I don't know, my lady. My career has barely begun. Never mind anything that you spoke of, I don't even know what I'm supposed to be beyond what others expect of me. Across the table, Lady Zaradnik offered him a quiet smile. Then it sounds like you're in precisely the right place to start. So this arsehole here comes charging in with the biggest shit-eating grin you've ever seen, and the whole damn camp just scatters in front of him like a tribe of goblins getting dropped on by a griffin. Except the guys that puked all over themselves. You're lucky the captains didn't have your ass for that stunt. Even if they did, Harlow picked at his teeth, it'd still be worth every second. That annoying preacher soiling those nice white robes of his was the best part. You sure your balls didn't rot off riding that thing around? Feels fine to me. That lady that came with sure makes 'em tingle though, in more ways than one. You seen her yet, Edbert? What? Lemme guess, she's right behind me. Rangobat buried his face in his palm. Not exactly, Lady Zaradnik said from Harlow's side. Sergeant Harlow leapt to his feet, somehow pivoting in midair as he jumped away 2 meters to stand at attention. The men he was speaking to around the campfire similarly abandoned their meals to stand with him. After learning that she was a ranger, Rangobat finally pieced together why everyone looked at him first before noticing the Baroness in front of him. The men in the ranger companies and those who scouted for patrols often snuck around as if it was second nature to them, and Lady Zaradnik was no different. He would lose track of her when he looked away and often found himself chasing after her voice as she moved around the camp. "Please be at ease," she told them, then turned to Harlow. "Have you settled on your preparations?" "Yes, m'lady," Harlow replied. "We'll be rotating men through short patrols to get them used to the undead. East to the edge of Meterless Lane and back again. About a day round trip." "How many will be ready in a week?" "We got 2 Death Cavaliers for each patrol and there's 14 men on a standard patrol. That's just over 3,000 men including our company. Assuming a day's enough for 'em to stop pissing themselves." The other men at the fire sent nervous glances in Harlow's direction. Lady Zaradnik, however, did not display any reaction to the sergeant's rough language. "So 2 divisions worth. Minus garrison forces, it's about that much. Orders from the higher-ups have detachments from each division lined up already." "Thank you, Sergeant Harlow. One last thing." "Yes, m'lady." "Where did you leave my Solita?" Out with the rest of the horses." Rangobart shook his head as they left Harlow and the other men to their meal. Most of the early afternoon was spent checking on the sergeants of the 1st Division's 5th Company as they prepared to help acclimate the 2nd Legion to the presence of their new undead allies. With the limited time that they had before the upcoming offensive in the blister, they couldn't cover the entire army group. Instead, each division would have specific companies readied for combined operations with the Death Series servitors. Lady Zaradnik made her rounds, ensuring that the men knew what was going on and that everything stayed on schedule. To most, she probably appeared as a friendly, reliable officer who worked to address any concerns that the men might have. "I'm sorry about Harlow, my lady," Rangobart said. "About what?" "His language. And that, comment." "I said that I didn't mind him being rough with me on the first night, didn't I?" "Yes, my lady, but still." They came to a field where hundreds of men were practicing in small formations. Shouts, curses and the clamor of training weapons filled the air as they took a seat on a platform overlooking the surroundings. Lady Zaradnik smiled to herself as she quietly watched the men continue to train. As usual, they seemed entirely unaware of her presence. "This is closer to what I'm used to, Officer Rangobart." It is? It wasn't anywhere near as fancy, nor were there as many people, but yes. When they weren't working or patrolling, my people were training and my family would oversee them like these captains and sergeants. In my territory, everyone had to know how to fight out of necessity. They weren't nobles or people from the cities or even the interior, they were loud, coarse, rough frontier people. This may seem strange to you, but being in this encampment makes me feel right at home. So you weren't offended by Harlow in any way? Not at all, Lady Zaradnik replied. I'm actually quite happy that he's comfortable enough to be himself around me. Before beginning my assignment, I wasn't sure what to expect. Unthinking aversion to the undead, entrenched attitudes and thinking resistant to change, discrimination and patronizing treatment due to my being a woman, millions of people being killed by a dragon, there is a mountain of things to worry about. Harlow sharing his appreciation for me is not one of those things. On the note of appreciation, I've found that the Imperial Army has been much more welcoming than I expected. Captain Germond readily accepted the way I did things. Do the noble women from the Empire's martial houses who join the army conduct themselves in the same manner? He wasn't sure if they did. This was mostly because he had never seen one outside of our winter. Most women of common background who possessed substantial strength were generally divided between those who served in the temples and those who leveraged their strength to pursue independent lifestyles. In the Imperial Army, nearly all women in service were members of the clergy. Of the thousands of Imperial knights in the legions who came from the ranks of the martial nobility, only one or two of those per legion were noble women, if even that. Because those who enlisted were generally exceptional, they inevitably made their way into the Imperial Guard, performing duties in the Imperial harem and propping up the image of the Imperial Army in the capital. Amongst the male soldiers, they were often treated like poster girls and almost venerated. After following Lady Zaradnik around for a few days, Rangobart did end up wondering if martial noblewomen in general naturally acted the way that she did. As the noblemen who served as captains of the Imperial Army inspired awe, respect, loyalty and generally high morale, so too did the Baroness, albeit with her distinctly feminine touch. She had a martial noble's presence and demonstrated a commander's skills on multiple occasions. Though they had never seen her wield a weapon, Rangobart highly doubted that she couldn't fight. A ranger who could sneak around an encampment full of soldiers so effortlessly would have the martial ability to match. "I've never served under one," Rangobart said, "so all I have to go by are rumors. Female warriors in the Imperial Army are generally strong for the obvious reasons, but I haven't heard anything about their interactions with the men around them. Now that you mention it, I haven't seen any yet. I suppose it makes sense why there aren't many." Captain German said something about them taking care of their territories as well. "If I may ask, is there some reason why you chose to serve as an officer for the Sorceress Kingdom? You are the head of your house and you have your domain to manage." "I think the answer is the same as the Empire's martial nobility," Lady Zaradnik said. "I come from a martial tradition, so military service seems natural. The individual power of a martial noble is far outstripped by the Sorceress Kingdom's regular forces, meaning that my immediate presence isn't required in my territory for day-to-day security. Our bureaucracy is also quite capable, so I'm rarely bogged down in the administrative mire that nobles in Riestais would normally be subject to. As such, I go wherever His Majesty requires me." Rangobart wasn't sure what to make of her reply. While the reason was straightforward, it spoke of an attitude that was rare for nobles outside of the Imperial Army. People usually aspired to more, and nobles were no different. A merchant expanded their business, a tradesman improved upon their goods and fashioned new ones, researchers sought knowledge. Every vocation had a craft. For nobles, that craft involved land and politics. Accruing wealth, influence and power in the pursuit of that craft was a given. This was often vilified in both tales and common perception, but it was what they were. A noble without ambition for their house and territory was a pitiful noble indeed. They were no different than anyone else that wasted their lives away. He did not think Lady Zaradnik such a noble, but her true ambitions remained a mystery. The Empire's martial nobility upheld and refined traditions passed down to them over the generations, pursued martial excellence and acted as the shield and spear of the Baharuth Empire. There were even some in the upper ranks who entered the arena of what might be considered civilian politics. Rangobart wasn't even sure if the Sorceress Kingdom had any politics to speak of. Additionally, their military might was so vast that he couldn't fathom why they would value the martial excellence of humans. Nor did he believe they would hold any value in human traditions. No matter how he thought about it, Rangobart invariably arrived at two loose conclusions. Baroness Zaradnik served as a face of the Sorceress Kingdom that the Imperial Army found easy to accept, and she served in her capacity as a liaison officer because she had no choice. He understood that it was a strange way to frame things. Nobles usually competed for such duties, considering them an honor and a boost to the prestige and influence of their houses. It was remarkable how one could see the exact same thing as coercion when the Sorceress Kingdom was involved. There was evidence to the contrary, but Lady Zaradnik was so well composed that it was impossible to tell whether she was being genuine or not. She displayed a tangible investment in everything, even watching the basic training of the rank-and-file infantry with keen interest. "Ah, that one messed up again," she frowned. He tried to follow her gaze, but couldn't figure out who she was referring to. It simply appeared as a field full of men training together. "Who?" Rangobart asked. "Those squads over there practicing in formation." Lady Zaradnik pointed ahead and slightly to the left. "The third man on the right in the southern group isn't paying attention to what's happening on either side of him." Rangobart narrowed his eyes, trying to figure out what was wrong. While he couldn't, the man's sergeant certainly could. When the sergeant eventually stopped the exercise and went over to address the soldier in question, Rangobart strained his ears to hear what was being said. Unfortunately, nothing could be heard over the din. "I don't see what he did wrong," he said. "The advantage to a formation like that," Lady Zaradnik explained, "is the weight of having many ranks and cover it provides. That cover is employed both defensively and offensively. In this case, their opponents are working together to displace the shields and weapons on either side of that man. He isn't acting to counter them, he's just focusing on the person in front of him. Potentially disastrous openings are being created, and, because the man is blind to it, he's risking the collapse of his formation." "You fought like this before?" "The equipment of the soldiers wasn't the same, but the principle is. There's some leeway when fighting in an entirely mundane fashion, but well-placed martial arts can quickly dismantle a formation if openings are continually created. A fireball making it through a gap in a shield wall would be catastrophic. The Imperial Army's strength lies in its organization, and capable adversaries will try to deprive it of that strength. Capable? Do you think the tribes of the Blister can actually contend with the Imperial Army on the field? Possibly. The Imperial Army is well trained, but its members are still only human. Beyond that, I don't believe you will be fighting any sort of conventional field battle. The Second Legion's leadership appears to have recognized that, which is why General Cabane considered Commander Lever's idea a sensible one. The initial meeting of the Second Legion's command staff was indecisive as to how they would accomplish their task. They agreed that the removal of the ancient green dragon was the determining factor in the upcoming conflict, but her removal and the ensuing subjugation of the Blister's interior was still a hotly debated matter that would require days of planning. Lady Zaradnik left Enns the following morning to both start the process of integrating the least undead forces into the Imperial Army and to learn about the operational capabilities of the Imperial Knights. After an hour of attentive observation, she rose from her seat and lightly brushed off her skirts. "Where to now, my lady? Is there a place where individual martial arts are practiced?" the Baroness asked, more advanced than the ones being practiced by these men. "Only the officers have those," Rangobart replied. "There's a field set aside for them near the center of the encampment, but there's no guarantee that anyone will be present. With so many companies present, the chances should be better than usual, yes? Lead the way." To Rangobart's surprise, the small field not only had a few captains present but seemingly all of them. A few spotted Rangobart's approach and Captain German walked over to greet them. "Lady Zaradnik," he nodded. "I suppose this was inevitable." "It was?" Rangobart frowned. "You haven't been around long enough, Reburbad," the captain said, "but it isn't often that we have such a large gathering of officers. Since the first batch of patrols is out, all of us captains are in one spot with some free time." "Did the commanders come out as well?" "They've probably gone into hiding knowing that this would happen," Captain German smirked. "Enns aside, the rest are martial nobles like us. We'd all be lining up to take a swing at them." Sounds of combat drifted over from the field, accompanied by cheers, or jeers. A number of off-duty knights walked by, attracted by the sounds of battle. Lady Zaradnik looked towards the source, but a small crowd already blocked their view. "It sounds like you have an event in progress," she said. "That's usually how it ends up." Captain German turned to lead them over to the field. "Let's find you a good seat before this place fills up." The skies remained overcast and the winter winds carried their chill over the land, but the brisk weather did not deter the crowd of excited onlookers. Contests between captains always drew soldiers regardless of their vocation. Enjoying rousing bouts was something like a national pastime of the Baharuth Empire. Its minority of detractors claimed that it only whetted an appetite for bloodshed amongst the citizens, which supporters claimed in return was, in reality, a benefit. As an ascendant power, pacifism would only hinder the empire's rise to prominence. At least that was the prevailing attitude before the appearance of the Sorceress Kingdom. It appears that the empire's appetite for this sort of activity extends beyond the bounds of the Grand Arena, Lady Zaradnik said. "Yes, my lady," Rangobart nodded. "Everyone loves a good fight. It's something I can understand those invested in related vocations might be interested in. But I was surprised to find that the fervor of the civilian spectators was even greater than that of the soldiers I observed in our winter." "That's to be expected," Captain German said. "Those who have not experienced life-threatening conflict tend to lean towards one extreme or the other. They can be absolute pacifists that abhor the application of martial power for any purpose, or they can be bloodthirsty fanatics ignorant of the tolls of war. Soldiers who have seen action usually have a more tempered attitude. Our appreciation of these sorts of matches is somewhat different than that of the average citizen." "I can see that being the case." Lady Zaradnik scanned the faces in the crowd. "My people had a similar attitude, I think. I suppose I never extended that idea to the point where it transformed into what I've witnessed in the Baharuth Empire. Riastais is very different in the sense that the vast majority of its leadership was civilian. I wouldn't say that they were bloodthirsty fanatics, but my Lord Father told me they had a large degree of separation from conflict that made them trivialize its realities." As they made their way to the edge of the field, the spectators gradually became aware of Baroness Zaradnik's presence. A space formed for her, creating a makeshift booth out of standing soldiers. At some point, a chair appeared for her to sit on. Yes, well, we could see that from the annual skirmish in Katza Plains. Captain German seated himself on the grass beside her. Though the fact that we were content to simply hold Riestize's royal army there probably fed into that. One year, we were on the way to teaching them a hard lesson for overestimating their chances, but Gazif Stranov came out and evened the score. It wasn't a pretty fight for either side, but it seems the idea that they had someone there who could do some real damage to us gave them something to hide behind and keep on with the sort of delusional thinking that you described. Beyond his name, the Baroness said, my knowledge of the warrior captain is little more than hearsay. Have you seen him fight? I was there when that mess I described happened. Frankly, I never want to be on the wrong side of anything like it ever again. He's supposedly a student of one of the schools of swordsmanship in Riestize, but he was so strong that I don't think that it mattered. Plate armor may as well have been paper. He went through entire squads of veteran knights in seconds. Rangobart had watched matches between the army's captains before and it wasn't anywhere near what Captain German described of Gazif Stranov. The captains all fought at a level that the rest of the soldiers could at least comprehend. The martial lords of the Grand Arena were perhaps the only individuals that he had personally witnessed who stood in the same realm as Riestize's champion. The scattered conversations around the field quieted down as the captain of the 1st Division's 14th Company faced off against the captain of the 2nd Division's 15th Company. While they were both fully armored, they used practiced longswords. Rangobart leaned forward slightly as the taller 2nd Division captain struck first. His opponent's figure blurred as he evaded the attack and came in with a diagonal counter that slammed into the side of the shorter man's left arm, just below the shoulder. No audible report issued from the blow. The 1st Division captain followed through with his strike, pivoting to block the blade coming in from his own left. The resulting bind was brief. Both moved to separate, blades held out in a long guard. Are these matches decided using some predetermined method? Lady Zaradnik asked. Some way to score exchanges, perhaps? How angry the clerics get at us is one measure, Captain German smirked. Duels like this one usually go on for about 5 minutes. Roughly 3 minutes in, the exhaustion and loss of focus from constant exertion result in telling blows getting through. This flow in your matches is the result of the Imperial Army's schools of combat? That's right, the captain nodded. Infantry train in spear and shield, sword and shield, longsword, and two-handed spear. Our cavalry have their own schools for mounted combat in addition to that, and then there's a loose archery school that our scouts train in. Is there much variation in the Imperial Army's combat styles? It looks like these two know exactly what to expect from each other. We train our soldiers to be able to perform the same set of basic martial arts, so there isn't much in the way of variation in the rank and file. How we use martial arts as an army is more important than the variety available to us. Even when officers start mastering advanced martial arts, their combat style is still reflective of the pace that our squads and companies can handle. As Rangobart understood it, this pace was already more than sufficient for dealing with the majority of the threats that the Imperial Army was meant to deal with. A student's materials on the subject often used the levies of Riestize as a point of comparison. The average Imperial Knight could last 5 times longer than their poorly trained and conditioned counterparts. Being a wizard, he couldn't exactly lay claim to this same feat, but even he could easily outlast the average commoner. Endurance was crucial for war. Soldiers weren't very effective if they only had enough stamina to fight for a minute. He wasn't sure whether this was of much relevance to Lady Zaradnik, as the undead forces under her command never tired, but it was something often overlooked by those who only considered conflict as a matter of relative strength. What if one becomes significantly stronger than the average Imperial Knight? The Baroness asked. We don't impose many restrictions on how they develop themselves, Captain German answered, but they still have to be mindful of the Army's standards. Since they undergo the same, basic training, you usually don't see anyone with a wildly different combat style. The only person I can think of who did was Lord Anek, and his two-shield style was still complementary to how the Imperial Army operates. Two shields? Lady Zaradnik frowned. I know it sounds strange, my lady, but it worked somehow. No, it's just that I've seen someone wield two shields before, so I was wondering if they were related in any way. The noise from the spectators grew as the fight progressed out of its first few minutes. Defensive martial arts became erratic and differences in training and experience grew more apparent. As their blades appeared to be headed into another bind, the 1st Division captain shifted his left hand to grip his longsword mid-blade. He turned his opponent's weapon aside, bringing the point of his own in line with the other captain's neck. To his credit, the 2nd Division captain reacted in time to push the attack away, but the 1st Division captain went with his opponent's movements. The pommel of his longsword came around to smash into the other captain's helmet. The man's head snapped to the side and the 1st Division captain stepped in to shove him onto his back. Shouts of approval rose from around them and the match was called. The combatants walked off of the field together towards a station where a handful of clerics waited to inspect their injuries. Another pair of officers walked onto the field. This time, it was the spear-wielding captain of the 1st Division's 2nd Company and the longsword-wielding captain of the 2nd Division's 1st Company. An excited murmur rose from the crowd. Are divisions and companies ordered in the same way that legions are? Lady Zaradnik asked. It's not as clear-cut since we don't shuffle people around all the time, Captain Germond answered, but it does loosely work as a rule of thumb. Agil, the swordsman, and Oryx are two of the strongest captains in the 2nd Legion, so this should be interesting. If Rangobart recalled correctly, both captains were said to be on par with platinum-ranked adventurers. Imperial Knights, however, tended to place themselves above adventurers of roughly equivalent strength under the reasoning that their formalized training, consistent stream of duties and traditions developed out of generations of service made for better fighting men. Much like the previous two captains, the current combatants stood across from one another, but the tension in the air was far more tangible. Captain Agil had his longsword raised in a high guard while Captain Oryx held an opposite stance that brought the tip of his weapon several centimeters over the grass. Dragon Fang thrust. Oryx moved first, exploding forward in a single, smooth motion. Lightning coursed over the blade of his spear. The weapon seemed split as it curved like the fangs of a dragon. Agil brought his blade down in a savage, diagonal slash, hammering the attack aside. Though he had deflected the strike itself, the elemental component traveled along his blade and coursed up his arms. Rangobart couldn't see the man's expression through his full helm, but he imagined Agil gritting his teeth as he lunged forward with a full-bodied thrust at Oryx's shoulder. The 1st Division captain was jarred to the side while bringing his weapon back up again, and he opted to disengage. The two captains eyed one another from a 7-meter distance, gathering their steps as they tested one another for openings. Who came out on top there? Rangobart asked. Captain Oryx is almost entirely unscathed, Lady Zaradnik answered. What was the attack that he used? It was a variant of Dragon Fang thrust, Captain Germond said. It's one of the most popular advanced strike arts in the Empire, developed 2 generations ago. What are the components? It stems from a twinned thrust, then incorporates an elemental component to the attack. Each element is attributed to a dragon's signature breath weapon. Since he used lightning, it was a blue Dragon Fang thrust. Isn't that unfair? They're using training weapons. The two captains in the field went through another exchange of blows. This time, Captain Oryx didn't employ Dragon Fang thrust. That's an ongoing point of contention, my lady, Captain Germond said. Many say that unapologetic use of Dragon Fang thrust will spur the other weapon schools to come up with elemental attacks of their own. So far, there haven't been any breakthroughs, but the spearmen still love to remind the others at least once a fight. I can't even imagine how the original developer figured out how to add elemental damage to a strike art, Lady Zaradnik muttered. Aren't martial arts conceptualized as the evolution of mundane techniques? That would be a question to ask one of the weapon masters, the captain said. Most of the army simply performs drills developed to lead to the use of existing martial arts. They don't go into theoretical stuff like that. So there's some sort of manual? It's a monstrous thing. Captain Germond indicated the thickness of the manual with his fingers. The sergeants usually just focus on what they're supposed to be training the men in, which is the basic stuff. The rest is just beyond what's needed or what most are capable of. At least the captain seemed to understand what Lady Zaradnik was referring to. Rangobart considered martial arts as esoteric as most people considered arcane magic. All he knew was that warriors could perform seemingly magical acts without expending mana, and they never failed to impress spectators in the grand arena. Shouts rose from around the field as Captain Oryx hurled himself into another rapid sequence of powerful attacks. Agil worked his blade deftly but only redirected a third of his opponent's strikes. Most of the hits glanced off of his plate armor, though a few landed solidly and managed to keep him on the back foot. Captain Oryx's style is very aggressive. Is it? Captain German raised an eyebrow. I believe most consider it extremely well balanced. Rangobot wasn't sure what constituted a balanced fighting style, but the onslaught certainly seemed aggressive. Despite using practice weapons, dents started to riddle Captain Agil's plate armor. The deceptively soft tap-tap-tap of the wooden spearhead striking against metal continued until one of the strikes suddenly stopped. "Uh-oh," Captain German said. Agil grabbed the arrested spear in his left gauntlet, stepping forward to secure it under his arm. The crowd erupted into cheers as his longsword worked in a merciless reversal of Oryx's assault. Under the rain of furious strikes, the 1st Division captain relinquished his polearm. He fell back as he drew his sidearm, but, after taking several more telling blows, a cleric on the sidelines called the match. "It seems Oryx wasn't the only one taking advantage of their training equipment," Lady Saradnik said as the two captains made their way off of the field. "There are things you simply can't get away with against real weapons." "Well, it's partially recreational," Captain German replied, "and we still draw much from these matches. It's instructional for the spectators, too. If you'd like to go get your equipment, I'm sure they would welcome your participation. Having the student of a combat school from outside the Empire will really spice things up." "I think it would be better to leave the captains to their bouts," the Baroness said. "There's still the rest of the encampment to get to before I need to meet with the General Staff in Enns tomorrow. We've yet to settle on the details of this operation, but chances are that you'll get to see me do a few things on the battlefield."